The moment of ego death, described poetically as the worst part isn't the fall but what comes after the landing, encapsulates one of the most profound existential crises a human being can endure. To understand this, one must first unpack what the ego represents in the psyche, and why its collapse precipitates not only disorientation but a psychic void so deep it challenges the very essence of identity. From a Freudian perspective, the ego is not the invincible master of the self, but a fragile mediator caught in ceaseless conflict. It negotiates between the ID, that realm of primal, unconscious drives, the superego, the internalized voice of societal and moral demands, and the external world, with its demands and limitations. The ego's primary task is to maintain balance, to create a coherent I that can function in reality while suppressing and managing unconscious tensions. Freud famously said, "The ego is not master in its own house." This phrase reveals a foundational truth: our conscious self, the I we identify with, is only the visible tip of a vast unconscious iceberg. Beneath the surface lie repressed desires, forbidden impulses, fears, and conflicts that the ego continually struggles to keep at bay. When the ego dies, metaphorically speaking, this fragile structure is shattered. The defenses collapse, and the carefully maintained narrative of self unravels. This collapse might be triggered by a sudden crisis, such as a breakup, trauma, or psychedelic experience. Or it may emerge gradually after years of internal struggle and suppressed conflict finally reaching a tipping point. The immediate aftermath of this collapse is often experienced as a paradoxical moment. There is an initial relief, a lightness, almost a fleeting peace. This occurs because the ego's ceaseless labor, the psychic effort to maintain control, suppress pain, and present a socially acceptable self, temporarily ceases. For a moment, the individual is freed from the burden of pretense and defense. However, this peace is deceptive and short-lived. What follows is silence, a void where the ego once stood. Without the ego's organizing function, there is no clear I to drive motivation or maintain purpose. The old ambitions and identities lose their meaning. The external goals and internal validations that once provided direction now feel hollow and irrelevant. Carl Jung's insights provide a crucial complement to Freud's framework here. Jung described the persona as the mask or social self we adopt to navigate societal expectations. It is an adaptive construct, allowing us to fulfill roles and gain approval, but it is only a facade. Behind this mask lies the shadow, the unconscious parts of ourselves that we reject, deny, or are unaware of. The shadow contains disowned impulses, emotions, and desires, both dark and potentially transformative. When the persona falls away after ego death, the individual confronts the shadow in its raw and terrifying reality. This confrontation is unsettling because it reveals how much of one's previous identity was constructed on fear, conditioning, and the need for external approval. The carefully scripted life suddenly appears as a fragile play, and the actor finds himself without a script. But this collapse is not a final annihilation. Jung viewed it as a threshold to individuation, the lifelong process of integrating unconscious material and becoming a more whole and authentic self. This process demands courage and patience, for it entails facing repressed parts of the psyche and embracing contradictions within oneself. The silence and emptiness following ego death are not signs of failure but indications of transition. From a psychoanalytic lens, this void represents a necessary psychic state in which old identities are shed, and new possibilities begin to emerge. Freud's concept of the death drive, the drive toward quiescence and dissolution, meets the life drive, the drive toward growth and creativity, here, creating an intense psychic tension that challenges the ego. In this space, individuals may feel lost, unmotivated, or numb. It is not laziness or apathy but a recalibration period in which the ego reorganizes itself in the absence of old narratives. The familiar motivations, rooted in external validation and conditioned ambitions, lose their hold because they belong to a persona that no longer exists. This phenomenon explains why goals and affirmations, once so motivating, feel hollow and ineffective. The ego to which these goals were addressed has dissolved, and there is no I to champion these aims. This psychic dissolution is a crisis of identity and meaning. However, within this void lies the potential for rebirth. The psyche is not a static structure but a dynamic system striving for integration and balance. Jung's concept of the self, a deeper, archetypal totality encompassing both conscious and unconscious, begins to emerge as the new organizing principle. The challenge lies in navigating this void without falling back into old, shallow identities or numbing oneself through distraction or denial. This requires patience, openness, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. It is the paradoxical act of embracing uncertainty and the unknown. Resistance is a central dynamic in this process. Freud's theory emphasizes that the psyche resists painful or threatening unconscious material. Resistance manifests as avoidance, repression, or denial, and it consumes psychic energy. The struggle against feelings of tiredness, sadness, or fear is itself draining. The passage's insight that the fight against tiredness is more exhausting than the tiredness itself aligns perfectly with this. When we battle our internal states, we deplete energy and prolong suffering. Conversely, acceptance, allowing oneself to fully experience emotions without judgment, creates space for healing. This therapeutic stance is foundational in psychoanalysis, to become entirely honest with oneself, and allow unconscious material to surface and be integrated. When the ego loosens its grip and ceases resistance, psychic energies flow more freely, enabling authentic motivation to arise. The analogy of lying in bed and acknowledging one's laziness without shame illustrates this beautifully. This acceptance relaxes both mind and body, allowing the natural emergence of impulses and creative momentum that are not forced but organic. Freud's insight that unexpressed emotions will never die highlights the danger of repression, which creates the shadow. The social conditioning that teaches us to judge emotions. Boys don't cry, anger is bad, ensures that feelings are buried alive, only to emerge later in distorted or pathological forms. The path to integration demands facing these disowned emotions and impulses. Creativity and authenticity spring from the shadow when it is embraced rather than feared. This is why paradox and contradiction are not threats but sources of psychic vitality. The tension between opposites, laziness as muse, sadness as softening rain, creates fertile ground for transformation. Jung's transcendent function, the dynamic interplay between conscious and unconscious, facilitates this process. It is the bridge by which repressed material becomes symbolized and consciously accessible, fostering psychic wholeness. Modern culture, with its valorization of productivity, disdain for rest, and distrust of intuition, often obstructs this process. The ego becomes overburdened by superego demands and social expectations, leading to exhaustion and alienation from the self. The final integration of ego and self is the ultimate goal. Freud understood the ego as mediator, not adversary. The ego must be flexible enough to serve the deeper self rather than dominate or fragment it. This integration restores coherence, enabling motivation to arise not from external pressure but inner resonance. Thus, the landing, after the fall, is not a descent into nothingness but the opening of a profound spiritual and psychological passage. The silence is not absence but fertile ground for the emergence of a fuller, more authentic self. As we continue our descent into the inner architecture of ego death, we arrive at a pivotal psychological and existential moment, the void. This isn't a poetic metaphor. It's a lived experience. For many who have undergone a collapse of identity, whether through crisis, awakening, or long internal unraveling, what follows is not light or clarity, but a dense, invisible weight. Motivation disappears. Direction disintegrates. The world still moves, but the inner I no longer knows why. This is the psychological space where most people get lost. And yet it is also the space where individuation begins. In Freudian terms, we could describe this phase as one of libidinal withdrawal. Libido, in Freud's vocabulary, is not limited to sexuality. It represents psychic energy in general, the drive toward attachment, desire, and investment in life. When the ego collapses, libido withdraws from its former objects, career, relationships, goals, even the self-image one had grown attached to. There is no more cathexis. No investment of energy into the old ideas of who we were or what we wanted. They no longer feel real. They no longer resonate. This is why we do not simply lack motivation in the void. We lack a self to be motivated for. What is often labeled as depression or burnout in modern psychological discourse may, in some cases, be more accurately described as post-ego death liminality. In this space, the personality as previously structured is no longer operable. The goals that once propelled us were scaffolding for a self that no longer exists. They feel alien now, artifacts from a former life. To try and get back on track is to miss the deeper invitation entirely. Carl Jung, with his rich mythopoetic understanding of the psyche, saw this as the terrain of transformation. He named this space the starting point of individuation, the slow, sacred, sometimes brutal path by which the unconscious becomes integrated into conscious life. The ego does not lead this journey. It follows. When Jung said, "In each of us, there is another whom we do not know," he was referring to the self, the archetypal totality of who we are, beyond our surface identities. The self sends messages, but not in the language of goals or tasks. It speaks through dreams, synchronicities, subtle urges, images, and feelings that defy linear logic. Freud, too, understood this. His clinical work revealed that the unconscious always finds expression, whether in dreams, slips of the tongue, symptoms, or creativity. The problem is not that the self doesn't speak. The problem is that the ego, trained by culture to privilege control, logic, and action, doesn't know how to listen. So when you are in the void and nothing feels urgent, when the old ambitions lie dormant and new ones haven't yet arrived, you are not broken. You are becoming. You are, quite literally, under psychic reconstruction. The exhaustion you feel is not laziness. It is the weight of psychic reorganization. Your nervous system, your patterns of attention, your desires, they are all being rewired. This is not dysfunction. This is transformation. Yet the paradox arises: how do we act when we have no drive? How do we move forward when we no longer believe in the directions we used to follow? Freud might argue that this is the moment where the subject must surrender to the process of working through, perturbating. In this therapeutic concept, Healing does not come from instant insight but from sustained engagement with inner material, especially the difficult, unclear, and contradictory parts. This is slow labor. This is psychic digestion. And what is the fuel for this work? Paradoxically, it is the very state you are trying to escape, your tiredness, your confusion, your apathy. These are not barriers. They are signals. The ego, used to efficiency and purpose, wants to fix or bypass them. But the unconscious asks that we feel them, stay with them, and ask, what are you trying to tell me? In your story, you spoke of lying in bed, paralyzed by the weight of inertia, only to realize that the fight against tiredness is what exhausts the most. This is a moment of great psychoanalytic significance. Resistance, as Freud emphasized, is the ego's attempt to avoid pain or conflict within the unconscious. But what we resist does not disappear. It returns stronger, more fragmented, more disruptive. What you resist not only persists, but grows in size, Jung echoed. To stop resisting is to start listening. When you allow tiredness to be, without judgment, it can reveal its deeper layer. Perhaps it is not simply physical exhaustion, but grief for a self you have lost. Perhaps beneath the surface of laziness is a profound mourning, or an anger you were never allowed to express. When you stop trying to fix it, and instead feel it, the symptom transforms into symbol. This is the alchemy of the psyche. This is why Freud's interpretation of dreams as the royal road to the unconscious remains relevant even now. Dreams are where the self, that deeper intelligence within, speaks without the filter of the ego. In dreams, contradictions coexist. Symbols form. Repressed content dances in disguise. And yet, in the waking void, we too are dreaming. We are walking through a liminal dream, half awake, suspended between identities. The key is not to run from this ambiguity but to inhabit it. This is what it means to begin the individuation process. Not to rush toward becoming someone again, but to dissolve with dignity until a deeper voice begins to whisper. The voice will not shout. It will not demand. It will suggest gently. It might say, go outside. Or, write a few lines. Or, rearrange the room. These impulses are sacred. They are not meaningless distractions. They are invitations from the self to re-enter life not as the persona you once were, but as the authentic being you are becoming. We are conditioned to seek clarity. But in the psyche, clarity often comes after confusion, not before. The ego's obsession with certainty is a defense against the unknown. But healing, as Freud and Jung both knew, happens not in knowing, but in staying, in remaining with the feeling, the image, the tension long enough for its deeper meaning to unfold. Let us be clear, this is not a call to inaction or victimhood. It is a call to radical presence. To stop running from what you feel. To stop performing for who you think you should be. To begin honoring the self that is trying to emerge beneath the rubble of who you thought you had to be. In this sacred pause, this psychic stillness, you are not failing. You are ripening. Individuation is not a return to motivation as we once knew it. It is the beginning of soul-level impulse. Not action driven by achievement, but movement drawn from truth. Not goals crafted by comparison, but expressions of what is alive in you now, however small. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the self as the guiding principle beyond the ego. It is not a concept. It is a living intelligence within you, organizing your experiences, pushing you toward wholeness. It sends images, dreams, and even symptoms not to punish, but to awaken. Freud might call it the return of the repressed. Jung calls it integration. Either way, the message is the same, what we bury comes back. And when we welcome it, it becomes part of our strength. So if you find yourself in the void, where nothing sticks, nothing motivates, and the world feels too fast for your slow heart, pause. Not because you are lost, but because the old map no longer fits the landscape you now inhabit. Let the silence speak. Let the void be your teacher. Let your resistance be your guide. Because on the other side of this threshold, something real awaits. Not a new performance, but a new self. The journey beyond ego death continues through a mysterious and often misunderstood territory, the shadow. If the void represents a psychic silence after collapse, then the shadow is the dense subterranean terrain we must navigate to be reborn. It is not only a container for the undesirable, but paradoxically, the very womb of transformation. It is here, within the darkness of what we reject, that the seeds of authentic creativity, wholeness, and inner power lie dormant. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung both pointed toward this shadow domain, albeit in differing language. Freud referred to it as the unconscious, a repository of repressed wishes, unresolved conflicts, and forbidden impulses. Jung refined and deepened this view, characterizing the shadow as the part of the psyche that houses all aspects of ourselves that the ego has deemed unacceptable. Anger, sadness, laziness, envy, desire, grief, vulnerability. These emotions and instincts are exiled to the unconscious, where they fester until they are met with acknowledgement. After ego death, when the old persona has dissolved, the shadow no longer remains in the background. It moves forward. Without the ego's defenses, the contents of the unconscious become more visible, more vocal, more demanding. Yet this confrontation is not a punishment. It is the psyche's way of insisting on integration. What we have repressed is not merely pathological, it is also potent. It contains our buried vitality, our truth, our instincts, and our lost authenticity. Freud often spoke of the return of the repressed. What the ego pushes down does not vanish. Instead, it returns in disguised forms, neurosis, symptoms, self-sabotage, unexplained fatigue, or, as in our case, a post-collapse lack of motivation. What if the exhaustion you feel is not a sign of failure, but a message from the repressed parts of you begging to be felt, expressed, and reintegrated? The act of embracing the shadow begins not with doing, but with seeing. To look directly into our own darkness without flinching is an act of tremendous courage. It is the start of psychological maturity. This is why simply affirming positivity or forcing productivity after ego death often fails. These attempts bypass the deeper process. They ignore the parts of the psyche that have been left behind. But within those abandoned parts lies your creativity. Not the polished, performative kind praised by society, but the raw, soul-driven expression that emerges when you stop pretending. Jung believed the unconscious was not merely chaotic, it was symbolic. It organized itself through image, dream, and metaphor. When you stop resisting what you feel and start expressing it, the psyche begins to speak through you. Art, writing, movement, even tears become language. This is where paradox becomes your greatest teacher. Freud himself was no stranger to contradiction. He acknowledged that the psyche is not linear, but driven by competing forces, desires, and fears. Jung went further to say that holding the tension of opposites is the space where transformation occurs. So, when you feel both lazy and longing, both angry and tender, both confused and clear, you are in sacred territory. Allowing paradox invites new meaning. When you stop labeling your sadness as weakness and instead see it as an inner truth-seeking voice, It becomes material for art. When you let your anger speak, you may find it has something vital to say about your boundaries. When fear is acknowledged, it often reveals what you most value. These repressed emotions become creative forces when seen and accepted. Creativity here is not separate from healing. They are the same movement. The more you allow expression, the more the unconscious is integrated. The more the shadow is welcomed, the less energy is spent repressing it. This is psychic liberation, not the removal of pain, but the release of resistance. Jung called this process shadow work. Freud might call it working through repressed material. But in either frame, the essence remains: transformation does not occur by eliminating the dark, but by learning to see in the dark. And once you can see in the dark, you begin to create from a deeper source. Not to impress, not to achieve, but to become whole. So, if you find yourself drawn to paradoxical ideas, or strange images, or emotional storms, do not push them away. Ask instead, what part of me is speaking now? What truth is trying to emerge? And how might I give it form? A sketch, a poem, a whispered confession, a journal entry. These are not distractions from healing. They are the work itself. In a society obsessed with light, it takes radical courage to sit in shadow. But the reward is not just integration, it is the awakening of your soul's most authentic voice. And once you hear it, you can never unknow it. Let us now explore how the self, the deeper totality beyond ego and shadow, begins to emerge, and what it means to live in alignment with soul-level purpose. As we emerge from the intimate confrontation with the shadow, we begin to perceive a subtle yet profound shift. The psyche, having faced its darkness and begun the long work of integration, becomes fertile ground for the emergence of something ancient yet new, the self. Not the ego, not the persona, not even the inner child, but the self with a capital S. This is not a metaphor. It is the living core of who you are beneath all masks. Carl Jung described the self as the totality of the conscious and unconscious psyche. It is the organizing principle that gives shape to your inner and outer life. Freud, while less symbolic in language, gestured toward a similar truth in his recognition of unconscious drives that seek expression and fulfillment through the ego. Jung simply dared to ask, what if the unconscious isn't only repressed material, but divine intelligence trying to incarnate through us? After ego death and shadow work, the self begins to stir. But it does not emerge with fanfare. It is quiet. It appears in symbols, synchronicities, dreams, creative urges, moments of deep knowing that bypass the rational mind. It calls not through pressure but through resonance. You feel something is true before you can explain why. This is the moment where soul-level motivation arises. It is different from egoic ambition. It does not push. It pulls. It draws you not toward achievement, but toward alignment. It does not shout, but whispers. It says, follow what feels real. Freud might say this is the point where the ego has been restructured enough to allow unconscious content to flow without repression. Jung would say the transcendent function is now active. The conscious and unconscious are in dialogue, co-creating a new identity, a new path. At this stage, many ask, what now? Life continues. Bills must be paid. Responsibilities remain. The world doesn't pause just because you have had a spiritual revelation. Here, the risk is bypassing again, retreating into the metaphysical and avoiding the practical. But integration means grounding the sacred in the everyday. You still have an ego. And that is not a flaw. The goal was never to annihilate it, but to reorient it. to transform it from a master into a servant of the self. The ego is your interface. It helps you decide, act, set boundaries, protect. But now, it no longer invents your purpose. It receives it. This is the profound reordering. When the ego serves the self, motivation is no longer rooted in fear, comparison, or scarcity. It arises from truth. You create not to be seen, but because there is something alive in you that must be expressed. You rest not because you're exhausted, but because you honor your body as part of the sacred. You speak your truth not to win, but to free your voice. This is embodiment. Not a performance of wholeness, but the lived experience of it. You begin to recognize cycles in your energy, rhythms in your soul's expression. Some days are for stillness, some for building, some for falling apart and reweaving. This is not regression. It is participation in the deeper wisdom of life. To live from the self is to let go of the illusion of control. Freud knew this. He saw how our need for control often masked deeper unconscious fears. Jung expanded this insight, suggesting that surrender is not weakness but alignment with the archetypal forces of the psyche. So how do you live this way in a world that still praises hustle, perfection, and external success? You become subversive, quietly revolutionary. You build your days around resonance instead of obligation. You listen to your dreams, your body, your subtle longings. You protect your inner life like a sacred flame. You learn to say no without guilt. You learn to say yes with your whole being. You make decisions not only from logic but from what makes your chest expand, your breath deepen. You begin to trust yourself. And when resistance returns, because it will, you do not panic. You greet it. You ask, what truth are you guarding? What part of me still needs to be held, heard, or healed? This is not perfection. This is practice. To live in service of the self is to be in ongoing dialogue with your wholeness. It is to remember that you are not here to be productive, impressive, or perfect. You are here to become real. And realness has a texture. It has weight. It anchors you in your own life. It allows you to move through the world not as a mask, but as a vessel. A vessel for truth. For love. For creative fire. For sacred presence. This is the final integration. Ego and self, not at war, but in partnership. The mind no longer fighting the heart. The body no longer ignored by the will. You. No longer fragmented, but remembered. Rewoven. Awake. At this point in the journey, the ego has collapsed, the shadow has spoken, and the self has begun to whisper its quiet truths. But now arises the inevitable question, how do you live this truth? How do you move in the world when everything you once did was driven by a self that no longer exists? How do you take action, not from pressure, but from alignment? This is the territory of embodiment. Freud recognized that human beings are not motivated by reason alone. Beneath conscious thought lie drives, resistances, complexes, and healing is not merely cognitive. It is somatic, energetic. Lived. Jung agreed and expanded. True integration does not stop at insight. It continues through incarnation. The truth you glimpse must be lived to be realized. After ego death, there is often a dangerous temptation to escape into the abstract. Many spiritual seekers fall into the trap of floating above life, clinging to light and detaching from responsibility. But awakening is not about detachment. It is about deeper participation. You are not here to transcend life. You are here to inhabit it, fully, vulnerably, and courageously. To embody the self is to allow your internal alignment to shape your external world. It means letting go of roles, habits, and rhythms that no longer serve. It requires rebuilding your life, not based on past expectations or future anxieties, but on moment-to-moment truth. But what does that look like in practice? It may mean you stop saying yes when your body says no. It may mean you rest when the world tells you to hustle. It may mean you create without a business plan, speak without a script, love without a mask. Not recklessly, but rooted in resonance. This is not chaos. It is coherence, inner and outer becoming one. Freud spoke of the cost of repression. When we deny our instincts, our creativity, our emotional truth, we become split. Symptoms appear. The psyche begins to revolt. But when we act in alignment, the body softens, the nervous system exhales. Even amidst challenge, something in us says, yes, this is right. This is why soulful action often begins with slowness. You are not here to produce. You are here to respond. To move from a place of deep listening. This is a radical shift in a world addicted to speed and productivity. Let yourself be moved, rather than constantly moving. You might feel called to change careers, to leave a toxic relationship, to return to a forgotten art. You might feel drawn to nature, to ritual, to silence. These are not regressions. They are recalibrations. Your soul is steering. And yes, fear will arise. Fear of failure, of judgment, of instability. The ego will whisper old scripts. You need to prove yourself. You can't afford this. Who do you think you are? But now, you have a different voice within, one that doesn't speak in demands but in clarity. Listen to it. This is where courage becomes essential. Not the heroic, dramatic kind, but the quiet, daily kind. The courage to stay with what feels real, even when no one else understands it. The courage to trust your timing. The courage to rebuild without rushing. Embodying soulful action also means embracing cycles. Not every day will be filled with breakthroughs. Some days will feel still, or even backwards. This is normal. The psyche does not move in straight lines. It spirals. It deepens. It returns. This is the fractal intelligence of the soul. Patterns repeating at deeper levels. Lessons returning, not as failures, but as invitations to embody more fully. Jung saw this in dreams. Freud saw it in neuroses. Both knew that repetition is how the psyche integrates. So when old patterns resurface, do not panic. Pause. Ask, what have I not yet embodied here? What deeper truth is being invited into action? Soulful living is not static. It is dynamic, responsive, alive. An action born from soul does not always look efficient. It may look quiet, even invisible. But it is powerful. A letter written. A boundary honored. A truth spoken gently. These acts rewire not only your life but your nervous system. The final phase of healing is expression. Not expression for validation, but as a declaration of embodiment. When you begin to create from what you know in your bones, you are no longer performing. You are revealing. And when you speak, write, build, teach, or simply exist from this place, others feel it. Not because you try to convince them, but because truth carries a frequency. Your presence becomes medicine. Freud said, being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. Jung would add. And living that honesty is the work of a lifetime. So here you are. Not at the end, but in the thick of it. Rebuilding. Repatterning. Remembering how to move. Let it be messy. Let it be sacred. Let it be yours. Because the world does not need more perfection. It needs more presence. And presence begins the moment you stop chasing and start embodying. And now you arrive at the final threshold. You have passed through the fall of ego, the silence of the void, the dark integration of the shadow, the awakening of the self, and the first steps of embodiment. What remains is not an end, but the emergence of a new myth. Not a fantasy, but a deeply felt story that aligns your soul's truth with your place in the world. In Freud's terms, you have worked through layers of repression, defense, projection, and resistance. You have brought what was unconscious into awareness. Jung would say, you have begun to live symbolically. Not literally. Not reactively. But as someone awake inside their own inner cosmology. This is what makes you sovereign. Because you are no longer just living a story handed to you by parents, culture, trauma, or survival. You are authoring a story from the self. One where you are not the hero in search of victory, but the vessel of meaning. A vessel of presence. Of depth. Of transformation. The new myth of you doesn't mean you must do something grandiose. It means you begin to recognize the sacred in the ordinary. That your daily life becomes infused with soul. That even your smallest choices now echo your inner alignment. That nothing is wasted. That everything is included. You may still face challenge, loss, doubt, but you meet them differently now. You meet them as the conscious self, not as a collapsing ego. You ask, what does this ask of me? What is being refined here? What deeper truth is asking to emerge through this? You become curious about your own life again. And slowly, something shifts. You begin to feel rooted. Not rigid but grounded. Not trapped but embedded. You begin to sense your place in the great unfolding. This is what ancient mystics called Dharma. What Jung called individuation. What Freud hinted at when he said the aim of psychoanalysis was to turn neurotic misery into ordinary unhappiness, and beyond that, perhaps, into creative living. To live your myth is to step beyond comparison. You stop asking, am I doing enough? Am I behind? Am I like them? And start asking, what wants to move through me today? What season am I in? What story am I here to carry forward? Your life becomes a quiet revolution. Not because you shout louder, but because you speak with your whole being. Because you show up rooted in what is real for you. Because you radiate coherence, and coherence changes rooms more than charisma ever could. In this new myth, your suffering was not a detour. It was the initiation. Your confusion was not failure. It was the veil lifting. Your fear was not weakness. It was the gatekeeper of transformation. You begin to see, you were never broken. You were breaking open. The self, once buried beneath layers of defense and distortion, now walks beside you. Not as a concept, but as a felt sense. A knowing. A quiet anchor. And here, life does not become easier. It becomes truer. And in its truth, there is strange peace. Not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of alignment. So you create. You serve. You love. You rest. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real. This is your new myth. And it was never far. It was only waiting for you to stop pretending. So welcome home.